Man, oh man, what a weekend. Man, first of all, let me apologize for how long that debate was. I can't believe I made it through. But that wasn't my fault. That was Cologne's idea to have that format. And needless to say, he probably thought it would work to his advantage. All I needed was like 5 minutes to prove that the way he defines Descarga is in error. And then basically prove that he couldn't find a definition anywhere that validates his findings. And you saw, and if you haven't seen the video or the debate, you probably have to wait. If you watch on Cologne's video, you probably have to wait probably like 2 hours in. I'm gonna get a little, it's gonna be less time on mine because I'm not gonna show everything. So if you want to see everything, you gotta go to Cologne's channel. I'm just gonna show some highlights and some lowlights, So that's what I'm basically gonna do. But like I said, if I just had 5 minutes, that's all I would need to expose him. And I think I clearly exposed him because you saw how he was reacting. All right. So needless to say, he didn't debunk any of the information that I put forward. You see, I'm saying that the influence comes from the Black Power movement because it's closer to the time that these songs came out. And how else would you be able to explain the number of Black American percussionists if many of them lived outside of the metropolitan area of New York? And those of you who haven't seen the video, I'll break that down as to why that's my theory. All right. So now, Cologne, you saw Cologne. He put out videos about me, and I couldn't believe it, but for some reason he felt the need to do that, and he'd been blowing up my phone, and he wants me to apologize because I called him a liar. In many cases, I do view him as that. Now, there was a situation where he was presenting some information about what was going on at the Palladium and the fact that Black Americans were going to the Palladium and Latinos were going to Birdland, and they were kind of hanging out with each other. And sometimes when you have things in your head, right? And when you speak, you kind of think you're saying everything in your head, but when you look back at the tape, you realize you didn't say it clearly. So that's what happened to me. Because when I spoke, it came across that I didn't believe that these musicians hung out. I do believe that, but clearly I didn't frame it that way. I was really focused on the fact that Cologne was presenting this argument that association led to the fictitious Latin breakdown. And so while Cologne deserves some kind of apology because I did call him a liar based on the perceived notion that I was doubting that these guys got together at all, he deserves an apology. But overall, if he still asserts the premise that led to the Latin breakdown, he gets no apology for that because I don't believe it. And so in that regard, he gets a partial apology. All right? So, like I said, I'm not going to play all the video. So if you want to see the whole video, you got to go to Cologne's channel. So with that being said, let's get into the video. And at the end, I'll give my closing remarks. All right? Peace.
True Savior, the floor is yours for your opening argument.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Check this out. It's been a while because I've been hearing a lot from Dr. Cologne and I've been listening and taking all this in. And it's about time I correct some information here. So let's get started. Dr. Cologne's premise really rests on the notion that there were no Africanisms in the New World. I mean, basically talk about North America. He basically asserts that the Africans that went to other places other than North America retained their Africanism, but the enslaved Africans in America lost them. So I'm going to play an audio clip of Dr. Cologne presenting that fact or that opinion, and we're going to dive into the misconceptions about that.
Was
was Cuba. So there you have it. It's known as the Descarga. Let me start back in. Hold up. Start from the beginning. The Descarga predates the b-boy breakdowns, the break beats. It predates this. Amazing. The Latin percussions. I mean, when you listen to b-boy music and you hear the Latin percussions going off, that inspiration comes from the descarga, which actually means, somebody letting go, somebody letting loose. That's what the term descarga means. And so the foundation of the b-boy breaks come from African and Latin percussions and influence. So you can see the what happened with the African diaspora when the Africans moved and they went to Haiti, when they went to Cuba, when they went to Puerto Rico, when they went to the Dominican Republic, they took the Africanism with them. They took the drums with them. It was not the same when it came to slavery in America. Slaves in America were not allowed to retain. It was the Caribbean. So let me stop it right there. So you see his whole premise in citing this Latin breakdown coming from the Caribbean or Cuba or Puerto Rico is based on this narrative that when the Africans came to North America, they couldn't bring their Africanism with them. So I want everyone to Google Africans drums banned in the US or African drums banned in America. And as I go through this, you will see that the story that Dr. Colon is presenting is not actually true. And when you Google that, the year 1740 will show up. And why is 1740 important? Because in 1739, there was a rebellion of some Angolan slaves in South Carolina, and they killed a number of white folks. And they believed that because of that killing, the use of drums were utilized in order to get these slaves together to commit this act, right? So in the year 1974, in the year 1740, they enacted a law to ban drums, right? So now think about this. The first slaves came here in 1619. If you do the math, 1739, that's 120 years. So basically for 120 years, there was drumming in America. You don't ban something that never exists. Use your head. So 1740 was the banning of drums in America. Under that logic, the idea that there was nothing going on in America is undermined by this particular fact. If you go to an article, it's called African Drums in the US. The author writes this: I suggest that the idea of drums and drum traditions disappear from African American cultural life is an overstatement. It seems more likely, even in places and times when the laws were banning their use were mostly actively enforced, these traditions, rather than dying, was transformed in synchronized forms. That rhythms are transferred into other forms such as padding, juba, ham boning, and only a portion of the story. In some instances, their use was restricted to specific celebrations. And in other cases, the techniques were transformed into European drums and percussive instruments, i.e. the drum kit. Now, let me read this other example here. Now, we talked about the other forms of synchronization drumming. We also have playing spoons, washboards, tambourines, praise claps. There's a number of ways Black Americans, if they didn't have the drums, they were able to still keep these traditions alive. So it's a misstatement or it's unreal. It's unreal to suggest that this wasn't going on in America at the time. Now let me go to this particular, give you an example of how drum tradition continued into the 19th century. Okay, let me read this. Another question is about the geographic spread of the law. Was the law followed everywhere? And then other than Charleston, South Carolina, other southern states through the late 18th and 19th century passed laws to prevent African Americans from drumming and dancing and gathering in crowds. In 1740 South Carolina, law is always identified as the reason drums were banned in North America. However, in 1805, a tutor in the district of Georgetown, South Carolina, reported hearing drums as an enslaved people dancing for Charleston for dancing for whites during a Christian holiday. This is a distance from only 55 miles north of Charleston and more than 60 years after the 1740 law. Your question, did the adherence to the law extend 50 miles, or was the law no longer being actively enforced after 50 years? So I have other examples that point to drumming still being practiced, African drums still being practiced long after the 1740 banning of the drums. Now I want people to look up this painting. It's called the Old Plantation. It's a painting, it's a watercolor painting, and it's said to have been created between 1785 and 1790. And let me read what it says about this painting. A late 18th century watercolor titled The Old Plantation portrays enslaved men and women during a moment of leisure or celebration. At right, a musician plays a four-string banjo, perhaps made from a hollow gourd, and another man strikes a makeshift drum, might be an overturned pot or pan. The figures at the center of the painting are dancing. The man bending down holds a long stick or staff. The women dancers are holding what appears to be a length of cloth or scarf, but might be an African percussive instrument traditionally used by women, known variously as the shakere. The instruments consist of boards surrounded by a netting that has hard shells or bones sewn into it. When a netting is pulled, the instrument creates a rattling sound. Now listen to this. This painting is described by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation as arguably the best known depiction of slaves in America, which captures the efforts of enslaved people to maintain African cultural traditions within difficult, often hostile contexts of plantation life. It is attributed to the John Rolls of Beaufort County, South Carolina. The scene probably took place on his plantation where, in the last decade of the 18th century, Rolls enslaved between 49 and 51 people. So this points to drumming tradition lasting well into the 18th century. So right here, I could really end right here in terms of dispelling the myth that drums were banned in America totally. There were some aspects of drumming in African traditions still alive and well. Now, I'm not going to stop here. Let's go to the north of America. In the Dutch New Netherland colony, especially New York, New Jersey, enslaved Africans combined the Christian tradition of Pentecost with elements of African celebrations to create a unique festival known as Pinkster, Pinkstr. Despite its Dutch origin, the early 1800s, Pinkster was considered largely an African American holiday. Pinkster celebration flourished in the area's heaviest Dutch settlements, the Hudson Valley, northern New Jersey, the western Long Island. These same areas also had significant population of enslaved Africans from the 16th until emancipation in New York in 1827. Okay, out from under the watchful eyes of strict control of their enslaved people, of the enslaver, people could express themselves using traditions from West and Central African cultures. Newspaper accounts describe the polyrhythms of African drumming, African language being spoken, the traditional dances, games, and other entertainment. Enslaved people born in Africa were revered as cultural gatekeepers, helping to preserve the traditions of dance, language, and other important cultural touchstones. For people isolated in rural areas, Pinker might be the only time they heard their native language being spoken. During these years, Pinkster was always presided over by a King Charles, a figure of great local renown and prominence within the Albany African community. Charles, an Angolan-born captain, claimed by Mayor of the Albany, was tall, handsome, and athletic, and a tireless dancer and gifted speaker. As the master of ceremony, he was responsible for directing the events and keeping the spirits in participation during long sessions of drumming and dancing and crowned the celebration. The style of dance, the complex layer of contrasted rhythms by the drums and clappers attest to the survival and the retention of Western African traditions. So the retention, so even in the northern part of America, they were still in tune with their Africanism. Dr. Cologne said that did not happen because he asserts that because it did not happen, this gave rise to the influence of the Cubans. Now, it's ironic that Cologne is Puerto Rican, respectfully, but he's arguing on behalf of Cuban culture. And so what he should be arguing is what did Puerto Ricans do? Because he's trying to say that they were a part of this foundation. And so it'd be interesting to see if he can cite what Puerto Ricans did instead of citing what Cubans did. Okay. Now let's get into the Descarga. You will find this in the LatinJazzNetwork.com. See, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you guys sources that you can look at. Now, I'm not going to go off the top of my head and make it up as I go. So everything that I'm saying, you could cross-check, verify. The name of the article is called Cachao, Cuban Jam Session, a Miniature Descargas. Now, this is what it says. Depending on who you talk to, Cachao invented the Descarga, the Cuban jam. More accurately, the Descarga was a natural extension of the feeling movement that had developed in Cuba in the 1940s. Julio Gutierrez, Diego Valdez, Petrinian, Neo Rivera were also involved in the development. Let me play this audio clip of Dr. Cologne, and respectfully, Dr. Cologne, this particular clip, it kind of shows you intellectual dishonesty, because what you do, you misrepresent what the Descarga actually means. Actually, you confirm what the actual meaning is, but then you give your own meaning, and you do that to make people think that it's something that it's really not. And it's an unfair tactic. Also, you suggest that the direction of influence came from Cuba to America, but in actuality, it came from America to Cuba. And I'm going to present that. But first, I'm going to play this clip of you making this false allegation.
How that definition is kind of misleading because it tells us that it was the Descarga was Cuban in its nature, and it was heavily influenced by jazz, and it began in Havana in the 1950s. So what American jazz musicians from America were in Cuba to influence Cubans with the Descarga? When did this happen, and who are these people? And so it develops in Havana, Cuba in the 1950s. Americans came from America playing, jazz, and then came over there and influenced those guys. No, actually, if you really look at it, it's the other way around. We influenced jazz. The Descarga, the Cuban music influenced jazz. All those forms influenced what came later. So the definition that I gave it, letting loose, going off, a jam session. It is the Descarga.
Now you see how he tried to fashion a new definition. So let me help Dr. Cologne out in terms of who was there in the 1950s when the Descarga was being created. Okay, Cap Calloway, 1949 to 1956, and the rest of it is all in the 50s here. Nat King Cole, Dorothy Dandridge, Eartha Kitt, Josephine Baker, Sarah Vaughan, Lena Horne, Johnny Mathis, Billy Daniels, and his stepbrothers. Now, Dr. Cologne, if you want, I can provide the actual newspaper clippings of that actually come out of the Cuban newspaper of these events happening. So just in case you doubt what I'm saying. Now, let me go back and let me say this. The Descarga or the Descarga is an extension of the feeling movement, and that came a decade before. So let me play for you a audio portion of a video entitled Old Man Bebo. And in there, you will hear the voices of Angel Diaz and Cesar Potrillo de la Ruz, and they're going to talk about the feeling movement and the influences from that period of time. I'm going to play it. It's in Spanish, and then I'm going to give the English translation. It's only about a minute.
De la música americana. disfrutaba mucho del jazz, disfrutaba mucho de la música romántica y éramos fanáticos y seguidores de las orquestas de aquel tiempo, como la de Duke Ellington, la de Benny Goodman, la de Thelonious Monk, un pianista llamado Fats Waller. Y nos íbamos nosotros, ese grupito pequeño, a los muelles de La Habana, para cuando llegaban los barcos de la flota blanca de aquella época, entonces bajaban los marinos, y generalmente negros, a bailar en los cabarecitos que había en los muelles. Ahí había unos aparatos que llamaban, en aquel momento se llamaban rodocola. Tenía muchos discos de música americana, de todos esos gente.
Y por eso es que el grupo nuestro comenzó a hacer una canción con una armonía más compleja, más moderna, que era la armonía del jazz, con algunos toques o pinceladas también de impresionismo.
All right, so let me get to the English translation to what those gentlemen said. We love American music. We love jazz. We love romantic music. And we were fans and followers of musicians like Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Thelonious Monk, or pianists like Fats Waller. At that time, our little group would go to the port of Havana for the arrival of the American fleet. And the soldiers, mostly black, would go to the dances at the local bars. And in those bars, they had jukeboxes called Rocolas, full of all those American records. And that's why our group started writing songs with more complex harmonies, more modern, with jazz harmonies, touches of impressionism. So there you have it. And this happened in the 1940s. And let me just give you an example just how far the influence has gone. This is in 1922. Radio broadcasting, which began in Cuba in 1922, was a major force in the growth of a new source of income for artists. Radio also exposed Cuban public to American jazz. So from 1922 all the way into the 50s, the American presence in Cuba was, it was all over the place. Let me see. Oh yeah, before I move on to another part, we were talking about the feeling movement, right? And you just heard the voices of Cesar Petrillo and Angel Diaz. Now, this is from an article entitled Bolero, Feeling, a Musical Revolution. All right, this is what it says. The feeling is a derivative of the Cuban bolero that was influenced by American music. Although sometimes it's complicated to describe what feeling is, its name comes from the word English feelings. This is due to the high degree of emotion the singers and songwriters add to their songs. It's basically a Cuban version of singing with soul. That's what the feeling is. The new style was influenced by American artists like Ellis Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan. Additionally, even Nat King Cole, who visited Cuba frequently, helped popularize it. Some of his roots are said to come from the blues, but keeping the Cuban music essence. Now, this is from the article entitled Bolero, Feeling, a Musical Revolution. This is not me saying this. This is other individuals saying this. When I talked about the Descarga, like I said, it came from the Latin Jazz Network.com. So this is what we're talking about. Now, let's go into the other misinformation Dr. Cologne wants to present. He wants to suggest that somehow Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie and their collaboration that created the song Manteca was the inspiration for African Americans who play the percussions. They got this from them. He also alludes to this notion that the Palladium played a part and influencing these African American percussionists, because what Dr. Cologne understands is that many of the b-boy anthems, the percussionists are African American. Now, the problem that Dr. Cologne has with asserting is twofold. Asserting that there were an influence is too much time in between. When you look at Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie, and you look at the Palladium, That's late 40s, early 50s. These Black American percussionists came out late 60s, early 70s. So where is the connection? You got to think about it like this as well. What were African Americans doing in the 50s? If they were influenced by these people, what were they doing in the 50s? They were creating rock and roll doo-wop. In the 60s, they had Motown. They had Stax Records down south. And the 70s, you had the introduction of the Philly sound, MFSB. Where is the Latin influence? There isn't any. It's more likely in time, if you look at what was going on at the time in the late 60s, it's more connected to the Black Power movement. And I'm going to go into that in a minute. Now, here's the other issue with this Channel Pozo and the Palladium connection. We're talking about a period where if you didn't live in the metropolitan area of New York, which consists of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, 9 times out of 10, you didn't hear of the Mambo. The same is true for the Latin Boogaloo. I grew up in Jersey. I heard Bang Bang by Joe Cuba. But outside of the metropolitan area of New York, no one's heard of those groups. All you got to do is look at the Billboard Top 100 nationally. You go from 66 to 69. Not one Latin Boogaloo artist is ever on those charts. That's because these were localized phenomenons. If you, like I said, if you live outside of the metropolitan area of New York, you didn't hear of them. Okay, so let me give you an example as to why you never heard of them. I'm going to play another audio clip of a gentleman. His name is Michael Chirisi. He's a dancer, and he was on a Mambo tour in 1955. And listen to how he describes the Mambo tour in 1955.
Capitalize on the Mambo craze, the best of the Palladium performers were organized to tour America. There was one attempt at the Mambo USA tour back, I believe it was 1955. I once went on a tour called Mambo USA, and they hired the best dancers, the best bands, the best singers to tour the United States for 3 months. Chance of a lifetime performance. We left the 3 buses all over. We went first to the Fox Theater from Membership. Second, we went to Connecticut from Membership. The next day, we went to Baltimore. That's where the nation makes noise. And then we had a really late come from the Palladium sanctuary and toured into all of discrimination. I was on stage with my partner. I used to do another poem in the Little Spanish Town. And when I was doing the Little Spanish Town, there were about 15 black kids sitting down front. Young kids, maybe 14, 13, maybe to 20. And the number goes. That was the first part of it. All those kids picked up on it, and whenever it came to that climax of the crescendo, they would all chime in. In the middle of that rehearsal, Chico was playing rehearsing them. 2 cops come up to me and they say, "Hey boy, get those niggas out of here." America could accept Hollywood's version, but not the real face of Mambo's diversity. Very unsuccessful. Mambo was supposed to be the biggest thing, and here they are traveling down south of the Midwest and everything, they're playing to empty chairs. The 3-month tour.
So you heard him say they were playing to empty chairs. Once they left the metropolitan area of New York, it bombed. So how could it be that influential? When you look at the African-American percussionists at that time, there was only one of those percussionists that lived in the metropolitan area of New York, and that was Jimmy Cass. All the others lived either in Chicago, Detroit. You think about people like Bobby Hall, Philly, DC. You think about the person who even played the bongos on Apache. He's from the Bahamas. Let me tell you, no one heard of the Mambo. No one heard of the Latin Boogaloo if you live outside of that area. So they're not influential. There is no Latin breakdown. There's no Latin influence whatsoever. He can never prove that. What's really true, what is a true nexus to why you have African Americans playing percussion is the Black Power movement, is the Black Liberation movement, is the Black Arts movement. In my promo video, I featured two celebrations, one in San Francisco and the other one in DC. And if you saw that, you would have seen these kind of celebrations, people playing African instruments, talking about Black nationalism, talking about Pan-Africanism, while playing congas and other African instruments. It was nothing related to Latin culture. This is the inspiration for why you have African American percussionists playing during this period of time. When I was in school as a youngster, I remember African troops, dance corps, and drummers coming to my school, performing and dancing. And that was the way it was during those days. And it started as early as 1964 in the universities across the United States. Just like Preston Epps, I featured him in the video. He was introduced to bongos and congas by way of Africans themselves. To suggest that it came by way of Cubans is ridiculous, and it goes against the history of this country. There's no evidence that Cuban culture played a role in what Black Americans did. Also, I showed a video of a person his name is Norman Bergeron, who's a professor of musicology. And he said the way African Americans play percussion versus the way Cubans is totally different. There is no relationship. These sounds, in fact, were here, was always here, never left. Let me give you an example of how powerful the Black Power movement was. Let's look at the dashiki here. The roots in the garment is not lost on anyone. It's unmistakably an African item. Its symbolic significance, however, molded thousands of miles outside the continent's borders. It was those of African descent, those ancestors were hauled to North America in chains who carried the torch. The civil rights Black Power movement of the 1960s, early 70s gave the dashiki a political potency. African Americans adopted the article as a means of rejecting Western culture norms. This is when the dashiki moved from beyond a style of functionality to become an emblem of Black pride, illustrative of the beauty of Blackness as an afro or a raised fist. Now, another example is, let me see, I don't want to go here. Another example is Kwanzaa. Well, let's talk about let's talk about Kwanzaa. Born out of the Black Power movement in the 1960s, founded in 1966 in the United States by activist and educator named Dr. Buanana Karenga. Kwanzaa was formed as a way to empower people to rediscover their African heritage, concretize the expression of the Nguzo Saba. This is a value system organized by 7 key principles. Now, another example of Black people in America, identifying with Black or African culture and identity is the African language of Swahili. In North America, learning Swahili has become one way Black Americans identify with their African roots. According to an article in the Harvard Political Review, this cultural linguistic connection was made during the Black Power movement. As the Black Power movement gained strength in the late 1960s, the language became, for the movement members, a symbol of meaningful Black identity, wrote the article's author. The timing was excellent in coordinating. Just as East Africans themselves were accepting Swahili as both a tool and an emblem of national pride, U.S. offering it a place in America, extending a significance to the swelling Black nationalism which organizations were engaged. So what I'm speaking to is a number of ways Black Americans are identifying with African culture through music, through language, through all types of expressions. Now, we all heard of the last poets, and let me show you how the congas, people want to say, Dr. Conga wants you to think, the congas mean Latino or Latin culture. first of all, we'll know there's no such thing as, Latin instruments or not Latin instruments, Latin percussive instruments. There's no such thing. All of it is African. Let's be clear. Let's not play semantics here. Now, we all know and heard of the last poets, right? Now, I'm gonna just read this because everybody kind of get an idea of who they are. We all oftentimes talk about them, but listen to this. The group's debut was May 19, 1968, at an event in Harlem commemorating the birthday of Malcolm X. The three poets were accompanied by a conga drummer. His name is Nairaya Ubabi, who was performing with another group that evening, but from then became a part of the Poets. The founding members called themselves the Last Poets, having been inspired by a South African poet. And I'm not going to butcher his name, but I want you to know where the inspiration comes from. It comes from South America. It doesn't come from Havana. So let's stop playing games with this, the influence, a lot of this stuff was already here, or it was gained from our knowledge or seeking our knowledge for African culture. That's where this all comes from. And so to say that it comes from Cuban culture or Latin culture, the evidence doesn't bear it out. I doubt Dr. Colon could actually present any documentation that proves that. Now, think about when there was a time when the African Americans stopped playing congas. The numbers of those participants dropped. And it's really related to one thing. Well, two things, but I'm going to talk about one thing in particular. The war on drugs. You might say, how could the war on drugs be responsible for the decline of African American percussionists? And that's because it was tied to the Black Power movement. And this is from Washington CNN. One of Richard Nixon's top advisors, a key figure of the Watergate scandal, said the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks and hippies, according to a 22-year-old interview recently published in Harper's Magazine. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman had told Harper's writer Dan Boone for the April cover story published Tuesday, and this is in quotes, this is John Ehrlichman speaking. You understand that I'm not saying, you understand what I'm saying. We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both of them heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Ehrlichman said we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So what did they do? They put a lot of our leaders in jail. They put an end to Black Power because it was becoming a very strong political movement. So they put drugs in our community, took our leaders away, killed many of them off. And another thing that was going on as the 70s near to the 80s, electronic music was coming into play. So now people was into drum machines, synthesizers. Black Americans were no longer really truly interested in playing congas in the way they were before. So, but if you was Latino, you could always play with a salsa band. And so that exactly led to the decline of these particular drummers. Now I have about 5 minutes. So what I want to talk about is the Latinization of James Brown. Now you want to talk about, trying to crowbar your way into the culture. I can't imagine a worse, idea to take on it in order to Latinize James Brown. So he wants to say that James Brown was influenced by Latin culture in some way. And so I want to point to, let me see if I could find that. Give me 1 second. Now, here's what we're talking about, the Latinization of James Brown. He points to his conga player, his name is John Griggs, right? In 1968, he played for a Latin band named Ismael Miranda and the Orchestra Harlow. But he didn't play congas for this group, but he played some kind of percussive instrument and he sang. So Dr. Colon is saying Well, that means John Griggs was influenced by Latin culture there, and he brought these sounds to James Brown, and James Brown loved this Latin sound, and he just had to have it in the Jungle Breakdown. You know, one of the world's famous b-boy anthems, "Give It Up, Turn It Loose." Dr. Clone wants to make that about Latin culture. Now, it's a ridiculous assertion. Like I said, it's one way to try to crowbar his way into the culture, and it's disrespectful to us as Black Americans because he's a Black American icon. And to say that he was influenced by Latin culture is disrespectful, to say the least. Now, here's a statement by a music teacher, instructor, or professor, I should say, from the New York University. His name is Ethan Heen. This is what he has to say about the Jungle Breakdown. There's an ugly history of racial slurs of African Americans around the jungle. James Brown made it a point to reclaim jungle imagery in the context of Joyful Pride. He had several songs that include a break where it was just congas and chanting about being in the jungle, brothers, swinging on the vine. Check out your mind. The history of agriculture and high-tech society is short. The Stone Age was long, and we'll never know exactly what the music sounded like in the Stone Age, but I bet that James Brown Jungle Breakdown give us a good idea. So that is the true essence of the Jungle Breakdown. Think about it this way. What songs, famous songs, came or sandwiched that particular song? In 1968, you had Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. In 71, you had Soul Power. Give It Up, Turn It Loose came out in 1970. This was, again, points to the Black Power movement, Black liberation, Pan-Africanism. It's all tied. This is where the inspiration comes from. It doesn't come from Cuba. It doesn't come from Puerto Rico. It doesn't come from Santo Domingo. It's totally disrespectful to say that. So, Dr. Clone, when you ask the question, why do we call you a colonizer? It's because what do colonizers do? They rewrite the history. They avoid the true history and rewrite it, just as you did when we talked about the whether or not Americans were actually in Cuba. And you said, oh no, it went the other way around. It was actually the Cubans that influenced America. That's colonizer activity right there. So I hope that answers your question as in regards to why we call you a colonizer and why we call you anti-Black. Because you speak about things, you pervert our history to suit your own agenda. It doesn't bear out in the facts, and it's totally disrespectful. So, I don't think, I pretty much covered what I want to say. I do have more time, but I'll give up my time and the next person can speak. I'm done.
Very interesting. Now let's move to the Palladium Ballroom. And this is taken from PalladiumMambo.com. Okay, so it says, known as the home of the Mambo, the Palladium Ballroom was America's most important venue for the development of Latin music and dance throughout the 1950s. Mambo music and dance were co-created at the Palladium, where, watch this, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Italian, Jewish, Irish, and African American patrons danced nightly to the music of the Big Three, the Latin orchestras, which were Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and Machito. The Palladium Ballroom began programming Latin music on Sundays in 1947 and soon expanded to an all-Latin format, hosting live Latin music Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. I want to read something again. This is so important, right? Watch this. In the 1950s, Mambo music and dance were co-created at the Palladium, where Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Italian, Jewish, Irish, and African American patrons danced to the music. I think that's interesting. I think that says a lot. We continue with the Palladium Ballroom. People like Mario Balsa, Tito Puente, Machito and his Afro-Cubans would be seen by the jazz musicians from Birdland. And those musicians would rock out with the Latin bands. The Latin musicians would also go to Birdland and rock out with the jazz musicians. This is what I'm talking about. We see this as early as the early 1900s. We see this connection, this marriage musically. We've been doing this together. We see this with James Reese Europe and Rafael Hernandez. We see this with Fletcher Henderson and Bob Escudero. We see this with Duke Ellington and Juan Tisol. What makes you think that we've been creating music together all this time, and suddenly when we get to hip hop, it stops? I beg to differ. Here we go. This is the influence of the Latin breakdown that you hear in the b-boy anthems. It is the Latin descarga, the go-off. What is the influence? It is this place right here, the Palladium Ballroom. These people, Mario Bausa, Tito Puente, Machito, the Latin musicians combining with the jazz musicians to create this sound. The influence of the Latin breakdown is the Latin descarga. Now,
Man, sometimes I think when Cologne wakes up, he wakes up lying. Now, he cited, you just heard him, he cited this particular website, PalladiumMambo.com, and he appears to be reading from it. But what you will soon discover is that he's going to add his own narrative to it and make you think that it comes from this article. See, he's looking for a way to legitimize his lie. So he's going to use this website to try to do it. So let me play again. You just heard it. I'm going to play it again, and I want you to read what he's exactly reading.
Ballroom. And this is taken from PalladiumMambo.com. Okay, so it says, known as the home of the Mambo, the Palladium Ballroom was America's most important venue for the development of Latin music and dance throughout the 1950s. Mambo music and dance were co-created at the Palladium, where, watch this, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Italian, Jewish, Irish, and African American patrons danced nightly to the music of the Big Three, the Latin orchestras, which were Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and Machito. The Palladium Ballroom began programming Latin music on Sundays in 1947 and soon expanded to an all-Latin format, hosting live Latin music Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. I want to read something again. This is so important, right? Watch this. In the 1950s, Mambo music and dance were co-created at the Palladium, where Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Italian, Jewish, Irish, and African American patrons danced to the music. I think that's interesting. I think that says a lot. We continue with the Palladium Ballroom. People like Mario Bausa.
Now you heard him say, we continue with the Palladium Ballroom. Now, you're not going to see everything after that. Everything after he just said that is not in this article. Let me play it.
Tito Puente, Machito and his Afro-Cubans would be seen by the jazz musicians from Birdland. And those musicians would rock out with the Latin bands.
I'm going to go to the next
Latin
page.
Musicians would also go to Birdland and rock out with the jazz musicians. This is what I'm talking about. We see this as early as the early 1900s. We see this connection, this marriage musically. We've been doing this together. We see this with James Reese Europe and Rafael Hernandez. We see this with Fletcher Henderson and Bob Escudero. We see this with Duke Ellington and Juan Pisol. What makes you think that we've been creating music together all this time, and suddenly when we get to hip hop, it stops? I beg to differ. Here we go. This is the influence.
Now he gets back. He just digressed. Now he's giving the impression that he's getting back in the article. There's nothing that he's saying right here that is in this article. You guys look it up for yourself. This guy is making it up to suit his narrative. What's new about Dr. Cologne? He's a habitual fabricator. That's who he is. There's no way to get around that. That's who he is. Let's continue, because he's saying, he's acting like he's getting back into the article. Let's go.
The Latin breakdown that you hear in the B-boy anthems. It is the Latin descarga, the go-off. What is the influence? It is this place.
Let me stop it. I'm going to go back so you can hear him say, let's get back into it.
Breakdown that you hear in the B-boy Henderson and Bob Escudero. We see this with Duke Ellington and Juan Pisol. What makes you think that we've been creating music together all this time, and suddenly when we get to hip hop, it stops? I beg to differ. Here we go. This is the influence of the Latin breakdown that you hear in the B-boy anthems. It is the Latin descarga, the go-off. What is the influence? It is this place right here, the Palladium Ballroom. These people, Mario Bausa, Tito Puente, Machito, the Latin musicians combining with the jazz musicians to create this sound. The influence of the Latin breakdown is the Latin descarga. Now we start moving.
All of that he just read, 95% of it was false.